really a very fundamental phenomenon that I think affects all of us in society. Probably most of us have some kind of insurance for property, for our car or for our house. That means we've entered an insurance contract with an insurance company. All of us, or many of us at least, has borrowed to buy this house or car, which means we have a loan contract with the bank that we're according to. When we bought our house or car, we wrote a purchasing contract with the seller of this property. And if we have a job, we probably have an employment contract with our employer. Okay? So all of us are affected by contracts. And actually contracts is broader than this, because many phenomena, many institutions we see in society are actually a contract or can be analyzed with contract theory. So for example, when we own something, when we have property rights to something, that's the type of contract that says what we can do with our property. If we, the political constitution in the country is a type of contract between the state and the citizens of that country. So this is very fundamental, and the theories that Martin Holmström have developed are incredibly important for us to understand these types of contracts and institutions. So one aspect of contracts that a lot of us think about when we think about contracts is that they're about sharing financial returns from some cooperation. Okay, so it basically says if we have a contract, who should pay whom, when, and how much. Now, from a theoretical standpoint, you can think about these as what we call a principal and agent problem. Okay, so a principal would be, for example, if we think about an employment contract, the principal would be the employer who hires someone to do some job. So the person who's hired is the agent. The agent is supposed to do some job on behalf of the principal. And what you have to do is design a contract, a compensation for this agent that is sort of designed in the best way. And it turns out these contracts typically have to balance two different forces. Okay? So the first one is that since the principal, since the employer doesn't necessarily see what the agent or the employee is doing all the time, you have to have a contract that gives incentives for this agent to act in the interest of this principal. Okay? To give the incentive part. But the other part, which is in conflict with this sometimes, is that you don't want to put too much risk on the agent. Okay? The employee is not going to be very happy if the pay, goes up and down and fluctuates all the time. So you also want to provide some risk sharing, some insurance to this agent. If we take an insurance contract, for example, okay, we would love if the insurance company fully covered our losses if we have an accident or if our house burns down. We would like to get everything covered so we have no risk. But the problem is that that's going to give us the wrong incentives potentially, because if we know we're fully covered, we're not going to take as well care of our property as we otherwise would have. That's why we have deductibles and co-payments, right? We have to pay a little bit ourselves if we have a loss. The insurance company doesn't cover everything, and that's to give us the right incentives to be careful. Okay? So risk versus incentives. So this is where Bengt Holmström's contributions are in understanding this principal-agent problem, how to design contracts. So this is an old problem. I mean, already Adam Smith talked about the principal-agent problem, but this research really took off thanks to Bengt Holmström's contributions and starting in the late 1970s. And he basically has a number of different research contributions that highlights all sorts of different important aspects of how to do these contracts. What information do you want to base performance on? What do you do when an agent has to be incentivized to do lots of different things, not just one thing? How do you incentivize a team? So maybe people are working together to produce something. How do you think about giving the right incentives over time? For example, how does your future career prospects affect your incentives to work today? Okay. So to be a little bit more concrete, let's think about an example that I think a lot of people are familiar with. How do we pay managers and CEOs of big companies? Okay, so this is the principal-agent problem. The principal are the shareholders. Okay, they want to hire this agent, this CEO, to act in their interest, to create as much value for the shareholders as possible, for example. So it turns out you can apply Holmström's different theories on lots of aspects of this problem. So for example, the informativeness principle, which is a famous result of Holmström, that talks about what information should you base, say, the bonus on. Okay? One implication of that, for example, is that it might seem natural to reward a CEO if the profits of their company is high, okay? But that means that's not the full story, because if we just base bonus on the profits of their own company, then we're going to be paying the CEO in many times just because they're being lucky, or punish them because they're unlucky. If you run an oil company, you might be more profitable just because the oil price goes up. That's just luck. We don't want to reward the CEO for that. Okay? So that's an implication of the Holmström's principle. Another natural example is that a CEO needs to do many different things to create value in the company. So for example, we might want them to really make sure that this year's profits are high, but we might also want to make sure that they take the best long-run decisions in the company. We invest in, let's say, R&D or long-term investments where the profit may show up far into the future. Okay? So how do you balance these incentives for this year's profits versus long-term value for the company? And one interesting finding here is that typically it's easier to measure profits today compared to long-run value. Okay? So there's a temptation to base the bonus on the thing you can observe, or easiest measure, right? Profits today. But that has a problem, because if you only base the bonus on today's profits, then maybe everything that the CEO will focus on is just this year's profits and forget about long-run investments that are important for the firm. So in that situation, maybe you can't have any bonus at all, not even on short-term profits, if you want to have the right balance with incentives. And the third example is this career concerns model of Holmström, which basically says that when you're young, you get an incentive. Even if you don't have a bonus, you have an incentive to do the right thing, because you might get promoted and get a pay raise in the future. But this also tells you that if you think about a CEO, maybe having a big bonus or performance pay is much more important when they're getting old and closer to retirement compared to when they're young and are incentivized by future career prospects. So that sort of summarizes Bengt Holmström's contribution. Now, Oliver Hart introduced another aspect of contracting that turned out to be very important and useful, which has to do with incomplete contracts. Okay? So, if we look at a contract, it doesn't just specify payments between people, but it also says who should have the right to decide on things in this cooperation. Okay? Now, why are these decision rights in these contracts? Well, it has to do with the fact that you can't specify everything in a contract. It will become impossible, they'll become larger than that. Okay? There's so many things that can happen in the future that we can't even imagine and write down what will happen in the contract. So when we can't do that, then we have to say, okay, what happens if something unexpected or unspecified happens? Who has the right to decide what to do then? Okay? That's where these decision rights come in. So what contracts also do is that they decide who should, or they allocate these decision rights between the contracting parties. Who has the right to make the decision when we haven't specified it before? And this is really what incomplete contracting theory is about. So again, there were sort of informal arguments of how to understand decision rights, ownership, property rights in this context, but there wasn't any formal theory before Oliver Hart and his co-authors developed this starting in the mid-1980s. The idea here, again, is that when contracts are incomplete, you haven't specified anything, then you have to write down who has the right to make the decision, okay, of what to do. Now, having the right to make the decision, that gives you power, okay? And that power helps you actually capture a bigger piece of the cake in your relationship, okay? So if you have the right to decide, if you own the asset, then you're going to get a bigger reward from the cooperation. And that in turn affects your incentives to, for example, invest in this relationship. So this is sort of the gist of the theory. They first applied it to the question of whether a firm should own its supplier or not. Okay, so that's called vertical integration. But it just turned out this is an incredibly rich theory to explain many, many different things. So to give you some examples, this theory was applied to understand, what is really the difference between a firm and a market. Okay? What kind of transactions, economic transactions, should better take place within firms, and which ones should occur in markets. It has been applied to understand this financial contracting problem. Okay? If we want to borrow or get money from an investor, how do we specify the decision rights in that relationship? It can be applied to organization design. So who should have the right to decide? Should the boss decide on everything, or should you delegate more to the employees? That's a problem you can analyze with this theory. And the last one, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, is the issue of privatization. Okay? So let's say a government wants some public service to be provided. We can think about a prison, or a healthcare hospital, or a school, or garbage collection. Okay? Should the government own the service provider, or should you write the contract with a private service provider? Now, without incomplete contracting theory, you really can't think about ownership. So let's say that the government wants to get both high quality of this service, but they also want cost efficiency. You don't want to spend too much taxpayers' money on getting this service. So you have these two goals. Now let's say you could measure some quality, and you could measure costs. Well, then you would just write a pay performance contract that gives, pays the provider more if quality is high and costs are low, and less otherwise. Now, in this world, it doesn't matter who owns it. You could have a government employee that has the same pay performance contract as, let's say, a private provider. Okay? So to get ownership to matter, you really have to be in a world where contracts are incomplete. You can't exactly specify in the contract what good quality is, okay, for example. So this gives a role for ownership, and it's going to be very different than if the government owns the service provider, or if it's a private service provider that you pay to do the service. So in general, it's very hard if you have a government-owned service to provide good incentives for either for cost cutting or quality. Because it's very hard to credibly reward government employees for cutting costs or improving quality. Now that doesn't mean that private ownership is always better. So Hart's model really tells you which type of factors go in the direction of public or private ownership. So for example, in a situation where cost reductions can really hurt quality, okay, well that would push you more towards public ownership. If future innovations to improve quality of services are really important and very hard to specify, well, that factor tends to move in the direction of private ownership in this model. And how competitive the private market will be also turns out to be very important. If competition is not expected to work very well, well then that goes in the direction of public ownership. So this isn't a model that says that one thing is always better than the other, but it tells you that maybe garbage collection has a different optimal setup than, let's say, a prison. So to conclude, this theory has really been incredibly important, not just for economics, but also for other social sciences. So everything ranging from corporate governance and firms to constitutional law and politics can be analyzed with these kind of tools. And thanks to their research, we now can analyze not just financial terms, who should get paid what, but also these control and decision rights, ownership, property rights, and other types of decision rights and contracts. And this theory is both positive, as we call it, which means you can explain the type of contracts we see in society, but it's also normative. It can actually help us write better contracts, both in public policy and in private